The wind howled against the walls of the old cabin, rattling the shutters as if nature itself wanted to break inside. She lay on the narrow cot, her breaths shallow, each one a sharp reminder of the ribs fractured inside her chest. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she had endured. Bruises painted her skin in angry shades of purple and blue, and her lips quivered as though even speaking was too much effort. He sat beside her, his strong hands unsure for the first time in his life. He had wrestled wild horses, tamed storms, faced down men with guns and hatred in their eyes, but nothing had ever unsettled him like the fragility of the woman before him. Her eyes fluttered open, and she whispered, "My ribs are already broken." Her voice was barely a thread, almost lost in the howl of the storm outside. He froze, the words slicing through his chest. He had wanted to hold her, to protect her, to make her feel that she wasn't alone anymore. But now he realized that even his embrace could hurt her. He drew back slightly, torn between his instinct to shield her and the fear of causing her more pain. Yet as he hesitated, her trembling hand reached for his sleeve, gripping weakly, as if begging him not to let go. So he did the only thing he knew how. He pulled her gently but firmly into his arms, careful as if she were glass, yet unyielding in his promise to never let her slip away. She winced at first, her body stiff with pain, but then something softened in her eyes. Tears welled, not from agony this time, but from the safety she felt, even in brokenness. He held her tight through the pain, whispering words she hadn't heard in years, words of comfort, of worth, of a future she thought had been stolen. The minutes bled into hours. He kept his arms around her, feeling every shallow breath, every trembling sigh. She leaned into him, trusting that even though her body hurt, her soul was being pieced back together. For the first time in so long, she wasn't fighting alone. His strength didn't erase her pain, but it made it bearable. His silence wasn't empty, it was a vow. Outside, the storm raged without mercy, but inside that small cabin, a fragile kind of peace took root. She was broken, yes, but in his arms, she found the courage to keep breathing. And he, who thought he had known everything about strength, discovered that true strength was in holding on. Not to power, not to pride, but to a battered soul who needed him more than air. The storm clawed at the night with a savage fury, hammering against the cabin as though it had been summoned to test the endurance of the two souls inside. His arms remained around her, not crushing, not careless, but deliberate and steady, as though he were building a fortress from nothing but his embrace. Each time she flinched from the ache in her ribs, he shifted just enough to ease her pain, never once loosening the grip of his presence. She had lived too long in a world where touch meant harm, where closeness carried nothing but danger. Now, for the first time in years, she dared to believe that arms could be safe, that a man could hold her not for himself but for her. Her breaths came ragged, cutting the silence like blades. He could feel them against his chest, each one a fragile rhythm fighting to hold on. He didn't tell her not to cry. He didn't tell her to be strong. He simply held her, because deep down he knew that words were fragile when bones were broken, but presence was unshakable. The flicker of the lantern threw long shadows across the rough wooden walls, stretching like ghosts of memories too painful to name. Her head pressed against him, and though her ribs screamed, she did not pull away. Pain was already her companion. What she longed for, and what he gave, was something stronger than the ache. Safety, shelter, a reason to believe that even broken bodies could still belong in someone's arms. Time seemed suspended. The storm raged on, but inside, his heartbeat was the only measure she kept. It was steady, unhurried, like a promise whispered without words. She let herself sink into it, though her body protested, though her mind feared betrayal. She had been taught that pain was inevitable, but now she wondered if it was possible that comfort was too. He ran his hand slowly, carefully, down her hair, entangling strands that had stuck to her damp face. Her eyes closed under the gentleness. She hadn't been touched like that in years, without demand, without anger, without intent other than to soothe. She wanted to tell him to stop, that she couldn't stand the way it unraveled her defenses, but her voice betrayed her. Instead, it cracked in a whisper, "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer right away. His throat worked as though the question was heavier than the storm outside. He finally murmured, "Because someone should have done it for you a long time ago." Her chest tightened with more than broken ribs. The tears came fast, streaking hot against her bruised cheeks. She had never thought herself worth saving, worth holding, worth the tenderness she saw in his eyes. Yet here he was, holding her as though letting go would be the greater pain. Every few minutes, she gasped when her body reminded her of its wounds, but every time, he only adjusted, wrapping her closer, murmuring low words she could barely hear but could feel in her bones. "You're safe now. I've got you. I won't let go." She wanted to argue. Safety had always been an illusion. Promises had always been broken. But his arms around her, firm and unyielding, were not an illusion. The warmth of his chest was not a dream. The way his heartbeat matched the rhythm of her breaths, it was real. Too real. And for once, she let herself believe. Hours passed. The lantern's flame wavered lower, but neither of them moved to feed it. Darkness crept in, but it was not the kind that swallowed, it was the kind that cloaked them, wrapped them in a cocoon where the world couldn't intrude. She dozed in and out, waking with sharp jolts when her ribs shifted, only to find his arms steady around her, like anchors keeping her from drifting into the abyss. At one point she whispered, "You should let me go. I'll only slow you down." His arms tightened. "Then I'll move slower. But I'm not letting go." Something inside her cracked, not another rib, but something deeper, something that had been hardened for years. No one had ever chosen her at her weakest. No one had ever stayed when she had nothing to give. But here he was, choosing to hold her even when it cost him. And she realized with a jolt that she wanted to live, not because she feared death, but because for the first time, she had found something worth living for. The storm finally broke toward dawn, leaving the world soaked and silent. The rain tapered off into whispers against the roof, and the first pale streaks of morning found their way through the cracks in the shutters. She stirred, groaning softly, her body aching from both injury and the long hours in his arms. He eased her back just enough to see her face, brushing away a strand of hair that clung to her damp cheek. "You're alive," he said quietly, as though the words were a prayer more than a statement. She blinked at him, her lips parting as though to argue, but no words came. Alive. It was a word she had never thought of as a gift before, but in that moment, she understood. Alive meant she was here, in his arms, breathing through the pain, not alone. Alive meant she still had a chance to heal. Alive meant she could still be loved. Her voice was hoarse, but steady enough to answer. "Only because of you." He shook his head slowly. "No. Because you kept fighting when it would have been easier to stop. I just refused to let you fight alone." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the exhaustion etched into his features, the redness around his eyes from his own tears, the weariness of a man who had carried her weight all night without complaint. And she knew then that he hadn't saved her out of pity or duty, he had saved her because he cared, deeply, fiercely, beyond reason. Her hand lifted, trembling, and rested against his chest where his heartbeat thudded steady. For the first time, she allowed herself to rest, not because the pain had gone, but because someone else was willing to carry it with her. She let her eyes close, not in surrender, but in trust. And as he tightened his arms again, holding her close despite the brokenness, she realized that healing didn't always begin with medicine or time. Sometimes, it began with the simple act of being held and not let go. The hours stretched on, quiet now except for the soft sounds of the world waking outside. He didn't move, didn't release her, didn't let the weight of her pain push him away. She drifted between sleep and wakefulness, always anchored by his warmth, always steadied by his presence. And though her ribs throbbed and her body ached, she had never felt stronger than she did in his arms, where brokenness was no longer the end but the beginning. Her breaths were shallow when she woke again. The storm had passed, leaving the world hushed in its aftermath. The cabin smelled of damp wood and smoke, though the fire had long since died into embers. She stirred slightly, testing her body, but the sharp stabbing in her ribs made her wince and freeze where she was. His arms were still around her, steady, strong, as though he hadn't moved all night. She tilted her head up and saw his eyes closed, though she doubted he had slept more than a few minutes. His jaw was tight even in rest, a man unused to allowing himself weakness. Yet he had stayed there, rigid and unyielding, so she could find peace in his embrace. Her hand shifted against his chest, and his eyes opened immediately, sharp and alert until they softened at the sight of her. "You're awake," he said quietly, voice low from fatigue. "I didn't mean to," she started, but her words broke when pain shot through her chest. He hushed her with the gentlest motion of his hand brushing her hair. Don't talk if it hurts. Just breathe. I've got you. The tenderness disarmed her. She had been spoken to with orders, commands, and cruelty for as long as she could remember. No one had ever said I've got you like it was a vow. It unsettled her because it was exactly what she needed. Minutes passed in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but safe. He adjusted his hold, lifting her just enough so she could sip from the tin cup of water he offered. She drank slowly, every swallow a reminder of cracked bones pressing against tender flesh. But he steadied her hand, never once letting the cup shake. Why do you care? She asked at last, her voice raw. His gaze lingered on her face, searching, weighing. Because I know what it feels like to be broken. And I know what it means to wish someone would stay when it would be easier for them to leave. Her lips trembled. She wanted to argue that no one had ever stayed for her, that people only came to take until there was nothing left. But she didn't. Not when his eyes told her that he meant every word. Not when his arms reminded her that this time was different. He shifted carefully, drawing a blanket tighter around her shoulders. You need rest. The ribs will heal, but only if you give them time. She gave a bitter laugh, though it came out more like a cough. Time isn't something I've ever had much of. Then I'll give you mine, he replied without hesitation. Her throat burned. She turned her face away, not wanting him to see the tears she could no longer hold back. But he did see, and without a word, he pressed his forehead gently to hers, a quiet gesture that spoke louder than any promise. He wasn't asking her to be strong. He was simply telling her she wasn't alone. The morning crept onward, sunlight filtering weakly through the cracks in the shutters. Birds began to sing outside, as if the world hadn't noticed that inside, someone's heart was learning how to beat again. He eventually stood, only when he was certain she wouldn't panic without his touch. He moved about the cabin, gathering supplies, keeping the fire alive. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked back to her, checking, reassuring himself that she was still breathing, still there. She watched him silently, studying the way he carried himself, not just with strength, but with care. His hands were rough, scarred, calloused from years of labor, yet they moved with surprising gentleness when they set the cup beside her or adjusted the blanket over her. When he finally sat again, she whispered, I don't even know your name. He gave a faint smile, as though the detail had almost slipped his mind. Ethan. She let the name roll over her tongue. It felt steady, unshakable, like the man himself. And you? He asked. Her lips parted, but she hesitated. Her name had been used against her so many times, spoken as a curse, as a command. It didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. But something in his gaze urged honesty. Clara, she murmured at last. Clara, he repeated softly, like he was testing it, giving it new life. That suits you. She almost laughed at the absurdity. Suited her. A woman with broken ribs, a body bruised, a spirit nearly extinguished. But the way he said it, she almost believed. The hours melted into day. Ethan coaxed her into eating a little broth he'd managed to make from dried meat and herbs. Each spoonful hurt, but he fed her slowly, patiently, like time itself had no hold on him. Clara couldn't remember the last time someone had cared if she ate, much less taken the effort to prepare something for her. She whispered her thanks, but he only shook his head. Don't thank me. Just get better. Her ribs ached fiercely when she tried to shift, and she winced, clutching her side. Immediately, his arms were around her again, supporting her carefully. Easy, he said. You don't have to move. You don't have to do anything but heal. Tears pricked at her eyes, unwanted but unstoppable. You don't understand, she whispered. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to just be cared for. His expression softened, pained. Then let me teach you. She broke then, sobs shaking her despite the agony they caused. He held her through it, not loosening his grip, not shushing her, not telling her to stop. He simply let her cry, his hand steady on her back, his voice murmuring quiet reassurances against her hair. You're safe. You're here. And I won't let you go. The words carved into her heart. She had been broken in more ways than bones, shattered by life until she didn't know how to put herself back together. But here, in his arms, she realized she didn't have to do it alone. For the first time, someone else was willing to carry the pieces with her. By nightfall, exhaustion dragged at her again. She drifted in and out of restless dreams, always waking to find his arms still there, his presence unwavering. And with each waking moment, she began to trust a little more, to believe that maybe this wasn't a fleeting kindness. Maybe it was the start of something she had never dared to imagine. Ethan stayed awake long after she had fallen into deeper sleep. He watched the slow rise and fall of her chest, the faint furrow of pain still etched between her brows even in rest. His hand stayed over hers, not because he feared she would run, but because he knew she needed to feel anchored. He whispered promises she couldn't hear, vows to himself as much as to her, that he would not be another man who left her broken. That he would fight for her healing as fiercely as he had fought for his own survival. And so the night stretched on, the cabin holding its fragile inhabitants close. Clara, broken yet breathing, cradled in arms that refused to abandon her. Ethan, weary but resolute, discovering that sometimes the greatest strength was not in what you could endure, but in what you could hold. The second night settled heavy over the cabin, darker than the first. The rain had stopped, but the earth was still soaked, the smell of damp pine drifting through the cracked shutters. Clara stirred restlessly on the cot, her body caught between pain and exhaustion. Ethan had pulled a chair beside her, refusing the bedroll on the floor, refusing even the comfort of lying down. He sat where he could watch her, where he could reach her in a heartbeat if she cried out. When she flinched awake, gasping from a jolt of pain in her chest, his hand was already there, steadying her. She met his eyes, tired and raw. "You'll wear yourself out," she whispered. He gave a faint smile. "I've worked through worse. You're the one who needs rest." Clara swallowed, the effort sharp in her throat. I don't know how to let someone stay." His gaze didn't waver. "Then let me be the first." Her ribs ached with every breath, but his words pierced deeper. She turned her face away, not because she doubted him, but because she feared what believing him would cost her. Too many times she had trusted, and every time, trust had shattered into shards that cut her deeper than fists ever could. Ethan didn't press her. He adjusted the blanket, brushed her hair gently back, then leaned against the chair. His presence filled the silence more than any words could. The hours dragged on, marked only by the shifting of the fire and the soft hum of the night beyond. Clara dozed again, but even in sleep, her body trembled as though expecting another blow. Ethan leaned forward, laying his hand over hers. The trembling eased, just a fraction, as though even her dreams recognized safety when they finally found it. By dawn, pale light seeped through the shutters, painting the cabin in muted gray. Clara opened her eyes to see him still there, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. Something in her chest, beyond the broken ribs, tightened. She whispered, "You stayed." "I told you I would," he answered simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Her throat burned. "No one ever does." He leaned closer, voice steady. "Then let this be the first time you're wrong." The weight of those words pressed against her heart harder than any bandage could. She blinked rapidly, fighting the sting in her eyes, but tears slipped free anyway. She hated crying, it made her feel weak, vulnerable, but Ethan didn't look at her like she was weak. He looked at her like she was surviving. Later that morning, he coaxed her to sip more broth, patient as ever when she struggled. Her hand shook holding the spoon, and before she could drop it, his fingers closed gently over hers, steadying her. He didn't take the task from her, didn't rob her of the small dignity of trying. Fingers closed gently over hers, steadying her. He didn't take the task from her, didn't rob her of the small dignity of trying. He simply stood beside her weakness, making it bearable. When she leaned back against the cot, exhausted, she whispered, "Why me?" He studied her face, his jaw tightening as though the answer carried weight. "Because you deserve to be held. Because you deserve to heal. Because somewhere along the way, the world forgot your worth. And I refuse to let it stay that way." Her chest ached, not just from her ribs, but from something deeper. No one had ever spoken of her like that. Worthy. She had been told she was nothing, treated like she was less than human. Yet here he was, seeing her as more than the broken pieces. The days stretched into one another. Ethan cared for her with unwavering patience. He changed the bandages where her skin had bruised, helped her drink and eat in careful portions, even carried her outside one afternoon when the cabin walls grew too suffocating. He held her steady as she breathed in the cool mountain air, her body fragile in his arms, her heart heavy with a strange mixture of pain and hope. Each time she tried to push him away with words, "I'll only slow you down, I'm not worth this, you should leave me," he answered the same. "I won't let go." At first, she resisted believing. But with every sunrise he remained, with every night he stayed awake just to make sure her breathing didn't falter, her defenses began to crumble. There were moments she caught him watching her when he thought she slept, his eyes filled with a sorrow that wasn't pity but empathy, as though he had his own scars carved deep inside. She wanted to ask, but the words never formed. She wasn't ready to carry anyone else's pain, not yet. But she noticed the way his hand lingered when it brushed hers, the way his voice softened whenever he spoke her name. Clara's healing was slow, painful, measured in breaths and whispers. Each day, the ache in her ribs lessened, though sharp reminders still came when she moved too quickly. But there was another kind of healing, one she hadn't expected, something fragile rebuilding inside her. She began to believe in Ethan's arms, in his steady presence, in the possibility that brokenness didn't have to be permanent. One night, as the fire crackled low, she whispered into the quiet, "What if I never get better? What if I'm always broken?" Ethan leaned forward, his hand finding hers. "Then I'll hold you through the broken pieces. Always." Her tears spilled freely then, but she didn't turn away. She let him see, let him hold her while the walls inside her finally fell. His embrace hurt her ribs, but for once, the pain didn't matter. What mattered was that someone chose to stay, not despite her brokenness, but through it. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Clara believed she might be more than her scars.